Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this part of the podcast where me and Phil are going to have a little bit of a chat about the current affairs, or state of affairs, I should say, of Warhammer, the corporation, their aspirations, thoughts, hopes and dreams as we interpret them, alongside how that is being consumed and enjoyed by us, the dear fan of Warhammer and Warhammer-related accessories. So, effectively, a lot of stuff going on at the moment within the world of Warhammer, not least in regards to many new additions, rules, codexes, things of that nature, but also a general consensus within the community that there's been a lot of loss of late. You know, many things being taken away, many things changing, many things being updated, or many things being replaced with new things. It's a topsy-turvy, crazy space, and we're just going to have a chat about why we think that might be, and generally kind of pontificate. Is that a word, Phil?
It is, yeah.
There we go. Now we're going to do some of that. I don't know if it relates necessarily to what we're actually doing, but that's the word I chose. But yes, that's what the general vibe of this segment is. Phil, can you succinctly distill the essence of that into some sort of header?
I'm sure I can. Do you want me to do it now, off the top
right
of my
now,
head?
Phil, come on. What is this section all about, Phil?
Why is Games Workshop splitting their model lines in half?
Oh, or even quarters, maybe thirds.
Maybe thirds, into their own individual game systems. And there is no cross-pollination between the two unless you happen to probably be knights or custodies, at least for 40k and Heresy. AOS and the Old World are the other sort of fantasy versions that are having a similar split and divide at the moment that we see as the battle tomes are coming out, in the same way that we see it with Heresy and 40k, although a lot of that has already happened, and the plaster has been peeled off with that one.
That's it. I think this is the thing, right? I mean, obviously this is all pure speculation. We haven't got the good fortune of having any kind of insider knowledge as it concerns all this stuff, but it's fair to say that the statement has been made often by ourselves and many others around this kind of current wave of GW releases, 10th edition Warhammer 40,000, 4th edition Age of Sigmar, and the kind of resurgence of Horus Heresy. Not that it really went away, but it has become more of a kind of mainline big product with the release of the 2nd edition, well, technically 3rd edition Horus Heresy that came out a few years ago. I think it was 21, wasn't it? No, 22.
What's the 2nd edition of Heresy?
Well, so the 1st edition of Heresy was based off of Warhammer 40,000's 6th edition. But because of what it was as a kind of general construct, it was more of an expansion pack to the game. Then when it became 7th edition, the expanded content that they had created through the Black Books and other things kind of augmented along it, but essentially there was kind of the 1st edition Horus Heresy, which was either 6th edition 40k or 7th edition 40k with Black Book bolt-ons, and then after 7th edition Warhammer 40,000 had gone out of circulation, a few months, maybe a year later, the Specialist Games team actually created their own bespoke rulebook for Horus Heresy. So that came in between the 2022 release and the removal of 7th edition Warhammer 40,000. I can't remember officially what it was called. I bought it once and then realised that I was never going to use it. So within the same day that I bought it, went, no, this is just stupid, and gave it back. So returned it on the very same day at Warhammer World.
I do remember them doing that, come to think of about it, because I remember distinctly they did the red books, which were the army specific books, and I don't know if they came before or alongside that one. I think they came before.
Yeah, but again, I think they reissued new red books to go along with that as well. But I think that's the thing. So I think, because there were the Black Books, which were obviously the epic tomes, and then they did the... Anyway, we've already... Look at us now. We had one topic to talk about. Now we're trying to dissect what the history of Heresy is. The point is there have been more than one edition of Heresy. Could have been 3, could have been 4, depending on how you interpret the various variables. But the point is that, there's a lot of stuff going on now that Heresy has kind of become, I guess, more kind of linked to this kind of annualized 3-yearly cycle, which is heavily rumoured to be the case, as we're expecting a new edition of Heresy this year. There's talk that there could be a new edition of Old World as soon as next year as well, which would mean that was potentially moving into like a 2-year cycle, which would be absolutely wild. But obviously Old World has come to pass, and there now seems to be this sort of need for GW to kind of isolate and distinguish their 4 kind of major IP pillars, if you will. So essentially you've got the Warhammer Old World, you've got the Age of Sigmar, you've got Warhammer Horus Heresy, and then you have Warhammer 40,000. And then obviously within that, you've also got other games like Blood Bowl, Adeptus Titanicus, Legions Imperialis, Blood Bowl, I said already, Necromunda, even Warcry.
Yeah. Warcry, Underworlds.
Yeah.
I mean, technically the one that doesn't fit under that category, which is its own, evil stepchild, which is Battle for Middle-earth, because that is its own separate IP. But in this context, it is isolating. It's its own thing, living in its own little world, so can't really be discussed in the same way. My
knowledge on that game system is really, really bad. I played it when it first came out in like the 2000s because it was the thing to do, because it was the new GW product, and Lord of the Rings was super cool. But I didn't really play it for more than a couple of years, and in a very sparing way. And I've really lost all sense of what goes on with that game. But it seems like every time you look at it, it's got a new face. Like at the moment, it's all War of the Rohirrim stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, okay, is that a whole new thing, or is it just the same thing with a facelift? Because they did the same during the Hobbit era. They just seem to consistently just kind of attach the latest film IP and just go, that's that now.
Yeah, I almost assume it's like a named edition in a way. And as you say, it is either a bolt-on or an expansion, but often re-released. To be fair, it comes across as much like Necromunda. Necromunda has only technically it's had 2 editions, right? It's had the very original 90s release, and then it had the, I want to say, 2013-14 one, which was Underhive. And then since then, everything's been an expansion, technically. But I think each of those boxes has had its own name. You've had Ash Waste, you've had the newest one that came out last year. They are really almost editions of the game under that branding, but the core mechanics haven't ever really changed, so they are all compatible with each other. And I think much like Battle for Middle-earth, it's just a branding exercise in terms of those naming conventions.
Yeah, indeed. I remember, anyway, we're going to go off on another tangent here, but yeah, the point is that, there's a bunch of different stuff. Again, Lord of the Rings sits in its own space, or Hobbit, or War of the Rohirrim. The Middle-earth stuff is its own thing. And then technically Blood Bowl's its own thing as well, because it's sort of an alternate fantasy universe where in place of pitch battles, they settle their battles on the pitch, which is totally fair enough. So, that's super fun. But yeah, look, the long story short is we're probably going to focus the conversation around those 4 key kind of overarching games: Heresy, 40k, AOS, and Old World. And just have a conversation about what's going on with that, what's the vibe, how we feel like it's impacting the player base, and what it's kind of creating. Because I think, ultimately, myself and Phil, we're definitely hobby butterflies. We've definitely got a passion and enthusiasm and a desire to play the greater majority of things, right? Like, right now, Phil, you have an extensive collection of old-timey-wimey Chaos Dwarves that you are attempting to build and paint, and ultimately debating whether you should put them on the old bases so as they are era appropriate, or whether you build for Old World, accepting that, who knows where, the future lies for Chaos Dwarfs in that particular game system. Will they get a re-release? Who knows, right? But the point is you're dabbling with that. You've obviously got your various 40k forces. You've also now got your Thunder Warriors that you intend to also use for Heresy. You've got your extensive Krieg army, which can obviously be used in Heresy as well in a militia form.
Yeah.
So you've got that side of things, and also you also play AOS as well. I myself do similar things, but with much less kind of hobby gumption than your good self, I would say. I've bought a lot of things, and I have, high hopes that at some point in the future they will manifest into playable armies. There just hasn't completely occurred yet, at least not in all instances, I suppose.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah,
we all have aspirations to play all 4 of those systems to various degrees of success, probably.
That's it. So that's what we're sort of saying, right? Like, without wanting to kind of self-aggrandize or laud ourselves too much, we are people who are exposed and attempt to play the greater majority of systems, and we are quite kind of system agnostic, even though we are probably ourselves more 40k and AOS centric these days. But yeah, that's the general vibe, just to kind of predicate this particular conversation. So yeah, I guess the most recent or most kind of prevalent event that occurred that really kind of created more conversations and more awareness of these kind of changes in GW ethos were definitely the arrival of Old World and how that whole process was treated, and then the subsequent release of Age of Sigmar and how that was directly impacted by the prior Old World release. So for context, and I swear I will let Phil talk in a second, for context, Old World released, and effectively it had a lot of miniatures within its range that were still also being used in Age of Sigmar. It also had a number of ranges that players have played, collected, and enjoyed for years that sat in their kind of Legends category. So they essentially went, we know that people want to play their Chaos Dwarfs armies, we know that people want to play their Dark Elf armies, but for various reasons, we're not in a place to support those, so they're going to sit in this nebulous kind of unofficial status, despite the fact that they have as detailed a selection of rules as any of the main factions, which was a very interesting decision on their part. So that was initially very interesting for the Old World players, because a lot of them had some initial frustrations in terms of how that was going to be managed and what that meant for them long term. And then obviously the kicker from that was then what happened in AOS 4 when the announcement of AOS 4 basically came with 2 very big caveats in the form of Beastmen and Bone Splitter Orcs, both basically being foretold to be leaving the realms, as well as obviously large amounts of Stormcast Eternals going into Legends or basically being removed from the game altogether. Stormcaster linked to a different thing, which we'll talk about separately. But Phil, what do you think the vibe was following all of that, and how did you think they handled it, and what do you think, mate? In context of Old World / AOS 2024 shenanigans.
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a mixed bag. I think people could see why those things were happening. So a lot of the Old World armies that were in Legends, like Chaos, Vampire Counts, Chaos Dwarves, Vampire Counts, as you said, Dark Elves, Lizard Men, I think, and Skaven. I think that was most of them.
Skaven, I think, was amongst their Legends selection. I think there was one more, but anyway, it's a moot point.
But basically, a lot of those have very heavy model ranges that existed in Age of Sigmar using those old Warhammer Fantasy models, because obviously when Warhammer Fantasy ended and Age of Sigmar 1 appeared, all of those models, with the exception of New Stormcast off the bat, were old existing fantasy models being rebased into Age of Sigmar, and even to this day that was the case for many factions. So Cities of Sigmar still have a lot of the old dwarves and Dark Elf minis. Cities of Sigmar also had all the old Empire models until the range refresh that happened maybe a year or so ago, and they got gorgeous new sculpts. Skaven, again, only just recently had, with AOS 4, a whole brand new refreshed army. Up until then, they were literally all using the old fantasy models for the lion's share, with the exception of like the odd Underworld warband and I think one character, like very heavily over-indexing in the old fantasy models. So I think it was fair to assume like, oh, this is the reason why. And same with like Lizard Men and stuff like that. So with the exception, I think, potentially of Chaos Dwarves that don't exist in Age of Sigmar, although there's lots of obviously heavy rumours that they are coming as a faction. They've sort of been teased a lot in the background, in maps. In the latest preview, there was a lot of speculation that the teaser at the end was for Chaos Dwarves. So if that is the case, that might lean into why they also don't want to bring them back into... the old world, potentially, because it does feel like, as you said, they want to have this clear distinction between those factions that could have crossover between two systems, and they ideally seem to not want you to buy a model in one and use it in the other, or potentially buy an army in one game and use it in the other. And the progenitor of that always seems like it was Chaos Demons, because you could use them in 40k, you could use them in Age of Sigmar, you could, I guess, technically use them in bits of Heresy as well. So
you can use them in Heresy, yeah.
Although with that one, it was like, oh yeah, you can use those models to represent the things that they're meant to be, but, it wasn't a complete like-for-like thing. They weren't like just called, plague bearers. They were like lesser demons of something or other, and you could represent them with your plague bearers, for example.
Yeah, I think it was similar to the rules around Imperial Militia, or just militia in the general sense, in so much as it was like a catch-all term for generic guardsmen, and they utilise a lot of the same equipment, gear, and kind of unit compositions, but ultimately were kind of something different. But again, I'm no expert when it comes to demons in Heresy specifically now anyway. But I know historically they were very well supported, but yeah, I'm not entirely confident with how they're supported.
They're a PDF. They're a PDF at the moment with lots of designer commentary saying represent them however you want, but just be consistent. So if you're using a particular model to represent one unit, you can't use those models to represent another unit as well, things like that, which does make perfect sense. But going back to the initial AOS 4, obviously, if you're a Beastman player, you're going to be really gutted, or Bone Splitters, but I felt like those were very underrepresented and not very well supported armies anyway. Not to, not to belittle people's feelings that had those armies that are suddenly not going to have them playable anymore in Age of Sigmar. That's obviously an awful, horrible thing. They obviously do happen from time to time, and it's a bit rubbish when it does. But
it's really rubbish, to be fair. I think it sucks, but the thing is you've just kind of, you get used to the fact that this is how GW work, right? Because they're just constantly invested in the idea of churning things and keeping people spending.
There is something to be said about like new models and new releases is like Games Workshop's focus in terms of getting people to buy whatever's new, and it's less about supporting the existing armies. But obviously, that also needs to happen, right? But the whole news cycle is always about the new models and things like that.
Well, it's interesting, and we can get into this. I think that there is a kind of looming conversation that is obviously needed to be had, and we'll get into it in a moment. But yeah, when it comes to removal of armies and change, it does feel like it is driven by a couple of factors. But it seems like more than anything, it's a business need to either kind of carve out and establish particular intellectual property around particular games. So the idea being that, Beastmen in the world of Warhammer, the old world, are a specific type of faction with a specific kind of lore. And with the way the range is and what they're looking at, there was no desire to kind of do an Age of Sigmar equivalent, or if there is, that's going to be far off and something they revisit when they have capacity to do so. But it made more sense to kind of, keep that range within the aesthetic of old world, because that's kind of where it predominantly sits anyway. And if it is that down the pipeline, if it is 3 years from now that they go, oh, Age of Sigmar, here's Beastmen again, obviously that's going to be exciting, but the aspiration will be that, hopefully people who had Beastmen before, or maybe still have old Beastmen, will be incentivized to buy the new ones because they are different, interesting ways, which kind of alludes to the conversation that I'm stating that we'll have in a moment. But I think that's the other thing as well, which I've heard said many times, which is also how Games Workshop, the corporate entity, recognizes success within its different studio groups. And I have heard that there is this thing where a lot of the success of Old World was somewhat unfairly, or I mean, again, fairness is, I suppose, objective, but ultimately, or quite obscure almost, but ultimately it seemed like because many of the miniature ranges that were seeing uplifts in sales as a result of the release of the Old World were attributed in a back-end kind of finance sense to the Age of Sigmar IP. Obviously the AOS team were probably enjoying a great deal of praise because all of a sudden their ranges are selling extraordinarily well, but not because of anything they were doing directly, but just by virtue of the weird way that these things are recognized. And I think from a business perspective, I think they do just want to get to a point where they are able to track and understand how, their products are performing relative to the game systems that they represent. So ultimately, these ranges are distinctly Old World, these ranges are distinctly 40k, and there is no opportunity for those things to be, cross-pollinated. They're their own things in their own world.
I logically that should make sense. However, I think on a practical level it doesn't at all.
No, I don't disagree.
And there's several reasons for that. So, the Age of Sigmar Seraphon, gorgeous models, but
Great
you
models.
could easily build them, buy and build those models and put them on square bases and run them as lizard men from the Old World using the legacy PDF. Games Workshop technically has no idea that sale is really for the Old World. However, you can have like the Empire and Cities of Sigmar, two distinct model ranges in terms of their look and feel, because they have diversified them stylistically. But so if you're technically buying the Empire for the Old World, you're more likely to buy the old fantasy models, but there is nothing stopping you buying the Cities of Sigmar range and kind of converting them to make the units compatible, even though they might not have like-for-like comparisons.
And I totally agree with that statement, and perhaps I didn't phrase it correctly, because what I'm saying is that's what is happening as well. And I think, again, you're right. Like, there's plenty of people out there that are doing that and were doing that because they wanted to get into playing Old World, right? So a lot of people will have bought Seraphon to rep as Lizardmen. A lot of people will have bought Cities of Sigmar. A lot of people would have bought, Lumineth Realm Lords for High Elves, etc. That will have happened. What I'm saying is that I think what they're trying to do, though, is get to a point where, in the general sense, they have distinct ranges that are for those specific games. Yeah. And I think across the bulk of their kind of portfolio, because again, on a granular one-to-one basis, yes, there will be maybe 1 in 100 sales of a specific kit will be someone buying it to use it for some other function. But the overarching majority of people are getting it for the reason that it is being sold for, i.e., most people who are buying High Elf Spearmen will be buying them to play or collect for use in Warhammer the Old World. There may be the odd person who's buying High Elf Spearmen to convert into a Guard regiment, but I imagine the general consensus is that 99% of the sale of that kit will be attributed to that thing. And again, I don't necessarily feel like it even matters necessarily what the use of that kit is. It's just more a case of understanding what the ranges are in isolation, and then being able to pinpoint particular upticks and performance increases. Because if some set of rules occur or change within Old World that sees a drastic increase in sales of a specific army, as a business, GW has a number of different kind of data points that they can put against. So if they see that High Elf Spearmen have a 10x increase in sale through because of a rules change, it's very evident why that was. But then weirdly, I suppose, say for example, the team at Old World all of a sudden see a 10x increase in Spearman sales, and they're like, where's that come from? And it turns out that, the Age of Sigmar team did a thing that made that more valuable. Oh, I get it. Okay, fine. But then it's a bit more of a kind of, the causality isn't quite as well understood. But again, that speaks more, I suppose, to the presumed fragmented nature of Games Workshop and how they operate. And again, that's heavily rumoured, but not something I've personally experienced because I don't work there. I don't know anything about it other than what people say about it. But yeah, what I was trying to say is I think, like, on the whole, I think it just makes sense that they're looking at it from that perspective as a business perspective. I think it's linked to IP. I also think it's just linked to their kind of sales metrics and other things that they're trying to track and understand.
I can totally understand that, but at the same time, not allowing, and this is maybe more 40k and Heresy specific because there's sort of precedent set from before. Before, every single Heresy vehicle was playable in 40k. Correct. Until the start of this edition when they were like, no, you can't do that anymore. And it's just going to Legends.
Did you see, though, Phil? Did you see what stayed in the Guard Codex?
Yes, apparently the Cyclops, and which I have, the Avenger Strike Fighter, which I also have, and that's it.
That's it.
Apparently, which is
yeah, so weird.
Which is an odd choice. One, because the Cyclops feels like it's sort of been replaced by the weird combat engineer mind thing, because that is how I would just represent it with my army. And then, out of the 3 fighters that they've just kept the Avenger Strike Fighter, odd that that's in there. Weirdly, again, the Arvus Lighter is ironically now in plastic, but then that's not in there either, which is a shame because often the majority of these things have happened only after or very shortly after they moved to plastic. So the Contemptor and the Leviathan went to plastic. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Space Marine players went out and bought them for their 40k specific armies, and then 6 months later were told, oh yeah, these aren't usable anymore. They're going to Legends, which is a real shame. So it's very anti-consumer practices, but I can understand it from a bookkeeping point of view that's, if the game systems are siloed off, and that Games Workshop wants to do like performance reviews or whatever based on sales, that makes more sense. Although it just is a worse value proposition, and it also sort of doesn't make sense from the point of view of if you don't play Heresy, but you have an opportunity to buy all these Heresy vehicles. That is a sale that Games Workshop is just losing out on now because no 40k players are buying those things anymore unless they can somehow convert them or represent them in some way in 40k via a datasheet. So you could go, Contemptor, I could just run as the generic Dreadnought datasheet because that's currently still in there but might not be in there for long. But, other things get a bit harder. And in a weird way, jumping back to AOS, they tend not to, now I'm not sure this is 100% correct, but they tend not to just remove something from the game. It feels like it gets replaced with a near identical unit with a different name. And to be fair, 40k does that occasionally when it updates its units. But
40k's been doing it for a long time now, and that was going to be my particular topic that I was alluding to earlier, which is I feel like Games Workshop have been massively influenced by the Primaris release. I think Games Workshop have looked at Primaris and they've gone, right, what did we do there? We took something extraordinarily popular in Space Marines and we completely reinvented them, but they were somehow still Space Marines. And what we did is we created a situation where we sold ice to Eskimos. We basically had a bunch of Space Marine players and then somehow, some way, convinced thousands of Space Marine players with fully functioning Space Marine armies to rebuy their armies. And the way we did it was we basically went, oh yeah, this isn't a tactical squad, it's an intercessor squad. Okay, cool. So what does that mean? Well, it's basically a tactical squad. However, it's not. It's an intercessor squad. And people went, ooh, give me them intercessors. Now, it didn't hurt that they released beautiful miniatures, but that I feel like has underpinned a lot of their thinking when it comes to these refresh ideas. So they basically worked out that essentially you, Phil, have a Krieg army, and you have grenadiers, and you have engineers, and you have, infantry, and you have horses, or more specifically, Claude
Death
mutant
Riders.
horses. Death Riders, yes, thank you. But the way they went with that was that we could give you a kit that is basically an engineer, but a new kit so you could continue using your old kit. But what if we gave you an entirely new thing, which is kind of the same as what you already have, but slightly different, almost like a Primaris Intercessor Squad? Maybe you'll buy that as well. And I think that's the thing. I think the Primaris range really kind of kick-started this. And I think where we are today is kind of like living with the impact of those 6-7 years of Primaris Marines and the impact that it's had on their entire business, because basically what they've realized is that they can take something and repackage it, rename it, and resell it to you, right? It's like when Coke brought back classic Coke. And to be fair as well, right? That's on the cards as well, right? Like eventually, when we're all sick of Primaris Marines, they're going to come along and go, classic Marines, anyone? And you're going to go, yeah! God damn, I love Mark 9! Woo! And it's just going to be like...
Well, Mark
it's going to be
7,
all that again.
right? But, yeah.
Oh, yeah, but what I'm saying, because they did the Mark X, didn't they? But
yeah,
they left that...
They left Mark 9 as a potential for, a new old style Marine. Yes,
Yeah.
No, you're all right. Because I remember specifically with the Tyranid range refresh, there were quite a few units that were very similar to old ones. And I think weirdly, in the first wave at least, the old ones weren't being touched a lot of the time. And it's like, here's a new unit that's very similar to an existing one, but given a slightly different name and does something quite similar, but not exactly the same. And as you say, the
neural boards or whatever they were.
Yeah, and the combat engineers are sort of similar. Whereas, like with AOS, it feels a bit more like for like as an update. So you've got the new, you've got the existing Graveguard models that they previewed at the LVO, but they're now called Barrow Guard. So they've given them their own unique name, which I think is in part to differentiate it from the fantasy model line. So the fantasy stuff can go back, and they've updated obviously the sculpts, and they look all great. But they look like they're the old ones. The old ones can still run as the new ones. Maybe they probably need to be rebased. But ultimately, that's a very like-for-like comparison. And they've done that a lot with 40k, to be fair. Like, Eldari haven't really changed. They haven't given you different units of striking scorpions or any of that. I think the bikes is the only one where they've given you new units. But other than that, everything else is a one-for-one replica. They haven't changed the names of anything. And I don't know if maybe that's, the sacred holy cow of Games Workshop, because the people that created that army still work there and probably still heavily invested in it. They wouldn't agree with any kind of change, but maybe in the future that either will happen, or maybe we'll start to see new units come down the line for them. It's odd that it does seem like it's a tactic that they've done for some things, but not for everything.
Well, that's it, isn't it? And I agree with what you said about Elder, in so much as obviously Jez is still there and he, kind of spearheaded those, and maybe to him he's kind of unable to kind of reimagine what a striking scorpion is, or reimagine what a... Because again, the thing is with Eldari within the kind of fluff, and again, this is all stuff that design team are very integral in, so I understand why that doesn't necessarily get that Marine treatment, or even the Krieg treatment, or the Cadia treatment. They did it with them. They didn't just become standard infantry, they became shock troopers. All this stuff is kind of very consistent with what they're doing, but again, it sort of speaks to that need to kind of update and up-res and upsell you on these things. Because here's the thing, right? I've played Warhammer 40,000 for a long time. I started playing in 1997, Phil. 1997. So what's that now? 28 years ago. So I will say this, in 22 of those 28 years, I could probably have gotten away with using more or less the same Space Marine army across those 22 years. Like, for 22 years, every time they did a new Space Marine thing, they go, oh, here's a new thing. Like, for example, from second to third, they went, here's a new land speeder kit, here's a new tactical squad kit, here's a few things. To be honest with you, second or third edition, I don't even really think we got anything massively new in the Marine book in that edition. I think they just gave us new sculpts for the old stuff. And then in fourth edition, they went, here's some metals for Vanguard and Stern Guard. And then in fifth, they went, here's a drop pod, here's some new dreadnoughts. Anyway, I'm not going to go through every flipping Space Marine change, but they basically went, here's one new thing, two new things, but it's still Space Marines. And you could have basically, for those first 22 years that I played the game, I could have had the same Space Marine army and just bolted stuff onto it for that whole time.
Well, yeah, because
it wasn't.
Gone.
Yeah.
No,
please.
Well, all I was going to say that it goes. It's a testament to Games Workshop like release rates, churn rate of how much they pump out as new models in a given year. Like it's insane how much they do.
Oh yeah,
and it used to be back in those days, you would be lucky to get one or two new kits for your faction in a given year at best. Whereas now it's almost like you obviously probably get a character model each year, or at least each edition when the codex comes out. But there's a good chance you'll get a complete range refresh where they will drop between 3 to 6 or 7 new kits for your desired faction, and some of those might be completely brand new, some of those might be redoing older ones, but they just sort of chuck them at you in a big drop, which is it's very impressive. Is obviously a lot to deal with if you want to buy it all, because it's quite expensive stuff. Some of it might be in a start collecting type thing, combat patrol. Some of it might not be. And they're doing that constantly. Pretty much every month you're getting several of those, it seems like, especially at least this time of year, because obviously you've had Krieg, you've had Elder, you've got the Git mobs for AOS, and then you've got the Soulblight Gravelord stuff coming. So that's four quite huge releases for only 2 of the systems. And obviously that's, yes, there's High Elves coming for the Old World. Although, and that is a big drop, although technically it's just obviously all old models, right? So it's not like they've...
Some new.
Well, I think there's like one character, something like that.
A couple of characters, yeah. There's What's-Her-Face with the spear and Geezer with the helmet.
Okay, yeah, so there are some stuff like that. But even so, just producing those models, reboxing them, doing the designs for all of that, that's all coming in a big wave. Heresy, slightly different. You don't really get... Well, actually, I say that. You do still get those big drops, but it's maybe like one a year, because obviously you got Solar Auxilia last year.
And Mechanicum.
And Mechanicum, yeah. Was Solar Auxilia the year before, or did they both come out last year?
They were both last year. Okay. And the year before they had Mark 3.
Yes, they've been doing the different marks, so we're likely to get some more marks. I think Crusade one's touted to probably be the next one, it seems.
Oh, cool. I hope so. That'd be amazing.
I think it's likely, because we've had a couple of characters in Crusade armor, and they tend to do the characters tend to be in whatever mark of plastic is coming.
But they had the Rhino, or the vehicle sprue has a Crusade guy on it.
Yes, he's the only one in plastic so far. But I think 1 or 2 of the characters in resin that have come out have been in Crusade armor. But prior to the... was it the Mark 5? No, Mark 6 Corvus armor? Or was that Mark 4? No, Mark 6. You had a bunch of characters in that armor first, so they sort of tease it with the characters, it feels like, at least to me, before they then do the plastic stuff. So it's not quite a whole faction specific like drop, because Heresy is more, for Space Marines, it's about the armor style, and then obviously you've got Solar Auxilia, Adeptus Mechanicum, potentially Custodes in plastic, which would be interesting, especially as we mentioned at the very beginning. Custodes is one of the current armies in 40k that still has access to the Horus Heresy units, and I assume they're given that special privilege because they sell well, and they know they sell really well for 40k. Because 40k Custodes has quite a small model range. and it's a bit weird. I don't feel like it's heavily being propped up by 40k, sorry, by the Heresy range, but I think the vehicle aspect of it is what sort of propped it up, like the access to the kind of Contemptor and sort of Leviathan style Custodes dreadnoughts. And then some of the grav tanks are very popular even now within the tournament scene.
Yeah, they're very strong.
Not even counting just the kind of the casual gamers that really like them. And it was sort of that reason was why I did the Thunder Warriors to be counted as Custodes, because I could do Heresy models and still run those Heresy models in the 40k version. So maybe I'll be undone in the next year or so. If Plastic Custodes come, maybe that's when they make that distinction. But then Plastic Knights, like the Cerastus Knights, have been around for a while now, and they still have access to Heresy.
For now, yeah. I mean, I think that
game.
I think that may change, but I don't know if it will, because it's weird. There's certain holdouts, right? Like Knights, Custodes, that kind of get to keep that, and I think that will be the case throughout the rest of this edition. But I do think that, Custodes players who are spending a lot of money on Forge World resin kits, I think there is a very high probability that in the next edition, the next Custodes release, that will no longer be supported.
Yeah.
I think the thing that's really interesting is that right now we've had like lots of loss, right? So literally 10th edition Warhammer 40,000 was littered with it. We basically got presented with loads of stuff getting removed straight away. Like they basically were like, here is all the marine stuff we're getting rid of. And the truth is, they didn't even tell you the full extent of it. They actually got rid of more than they told you they got rid of. But obviously what they told you was pretty extensive. And I think we're going to see more of that. I think it's highly probable that in the next edition, almost all firstborn units will just be removed entirely. I'm not entirely sure. I actually don't believe that we will see Tactical Marines, Devastator Marines, Centurions continue to exist. I think they're gone. I think Flyers are in all probability gone. I think all flavours of Flyers in 40k are probably going to go.
Across the board, across all of them,
across the board.
Interesting, because obviously some of them don't have Heresy equivalents, because most of them.
No, agreed.
But so yeah, it would be interesting. Is the game better without Flyers? Potentially, just because of the. And I've said it a bunch of times. The way every army has access to deep strike or some kind of effectively just deep strike rules, right? You have very little need for flyers or drop pods to transport models on the tabletop, because they're just being done via other methods now, and they tend not to be good enough as a gun platform in their own right to sort of justify them on the table. And with the table sizes shrinking since 9th edition, it just hasn't really. They haven't found their footing ever, really. Obviously, they can be good sometimes, like competitively and stuff like that. But yeah,
I think
would
with
the game
me,
be better without them? Possibly.
I think with some original game design and some actual creative thinking, I think there could be a place for Flyers. I just don't know. GW have this strange relationship between how they want models on the table to interact in terms of current game design. But I think there are ways you make Flyers interesting and you keep them, but they become more tokens. They become more representative of a rule set. So it's like, I have a flyer, and to represent that, this is the miniature that I have for the flyer, and effectively the miniature is placed in like table quarters to denote its location or its coordinates, but it's loosely placed, much like how Gloomspite Gits players indicate the position of the moon. Right. It's like there's a token, which in this case is represented by this particular type of flyer, and effectively, come up with rules where, it can basically sit in a quadrant a turn, but then after it has sat in that quadrant for that turn, it then flies off the board. So across a 5-turn game, you basically get a flyer to be on the table 3 out of 5 turns, and it has like other benefits. So maybe it can give you abilities to reduce the benefits of cover saves. Maybe it gives you improved intel ballistic skill. Maybe it helps you, neutralize effects like stealth, for example. So say if a unit had stealth, but there's a flyer within the quadrant that they occupy, stealth is deactivated because you have eyes in the sky. Like those kind of rules that become more interesting, rather than I have a flyer and it's just doing donuts around this board.
Yeah, I guess if you were like, all flyers have to be in hover mode, that thematically could be. But the idea that maybe you do something like a strafing run. I'm sure Bolt Action used to have a similar thing, but you used smaller models to represent them. So it might be on your table edge, you put your vehicle down, your flyer down, for like a turn, so your turn, your opponent's turn, so your opponent can react to it. And it's like, this is where the flyer is coming on to do a strafing run. Your opponent has a chance to shoot it down from that general direction. And then in your second turn, it's just off the board and it's sort of gone in a straight line and it's done something or hit a target or shot at something, as you say, to represent that fast moving speed. So you could do things like that. Is it a big model that's not really on the tabletop? Is that somewhat disappointing? A little bit, maybe, because it's so huge and it's a lot of effort to build and paint up. You know, I love the idea of, especially the Guard, like sort of flying heavy armies. So whether that's with Scions or like those kind of Elysian style armies that unfortunately Elysian isn't really in the game anymore. But the Tempestos like Scions, you was very like lent into the kind of flyer build. So it's a shame to not have them as a playable army. I think is a bit of a shame, but like I said, maybe there are better ways to represent flyers within the game overall.
Yeah, I think so. And not to get too kind of blue sky with it, I think that would really help though, because I'd rather they come up with a sort of added gameplay layer that explicitly expresses the idea of flyers in this type of tabletop scenario to give them a fair place, but also to create some interesting tactical decision making. Because again, it's that thing, isn't it? It's like you could maybe, for example, if it is a flyer that specifically operates as a troop drop-off, you could use the same quadrant idea and then create a situation where deep striking units could come out, or rather units could be deployed in that quadrant using the deep strike rule on the assertion that the aircraft is in that space. But, you know, again, it becomes one of those things of, if you're using the transport thing, it has to come in turns 2, and it can only come on the board, say, turns 2 and 4. So you have like some other tactical flexibility, but it doesn't necessarily offer other benefits. And it becomes like a trade-off and becomes more interesting. I also think, like, because that's the thing, there are also vehicles that maybe kind of fulfill more of a kind of helicopter status. And that, you know, a helicopter, an Apache, or more specifically,
gunship?
The transport one that is Chinook. That's it.
Oh, right, yeah.
Like one of those, like that makes sense in the context of Warhammer 40,000. This thing is going to go up, move at a relative pace to another place and put people there.
Yeah.
That to me kind of feels logical within the kind of battlefield scale. But the area where it goes absurd is when you deal with things like Elder, where you deal with things like even like Guard or Marines, where they've got these, you know, where they've got these jet engine propelled.
Yeah, like the sort of dogfighter style.
Yeah, that stuff really needs to just sort of... And again, you could interestingly add in another layer. They did this in 7th edition with their expansion.
Death in the Skies.
Death in the Skies. Now, again,
which
that
I didn't
was...
like.
I didn't like it at all because it was 7th edition. It was completely optional and unnecessarily complicated.
It was completely optional unless one of you opted into it, in which case you both had to do it. That was the rule. So, so famously, I've talked about it many times, at a tournament, my opponent had 2 Orc, like Dakka jets, and I had my Avenger Strike Fighter. I was like, I don't have these rules. I don't have the book. He was like, well, I'm electing to do it, so we have to do it. I was like, okay. And then there's a bunch of maneuvers that you can both select from. This is all pre-game. And I was like, okay, I'm turning left or whatever it was. And then eventually, after resolving a bunch of these random guesses, my fly got shot out of the sky before the game even began. And I was like, oh, okay, this feels great. Yay.
I mean, it was... That in that instance and that whole situation was exactly that, though. It was essentially a kind of gotcha for people that weren't as, you know, I guess, well prepared as this individual. But the point is, though, is I think, like, there's things you can do with flyers, there's things you can do
concept-wise,
with...
it's very, very interesting, though.
Yeah, exactly. And there's stuff you can do with it. But regardless of that, my point is I think flyers either go away or become like that. And then I think, yeah, firstborn. And I think that's the thing, right? I think ultimately we are staring down the barrel of more loss, more change, more disappointment. Because it happens all the time, right? The Eldari books come out, we've lost a bunch of stuff. Not, necessarily too much in the grand scheme of things. How many people were running Prince Uriel before? I don't know, but you can't now. How many people were using Illic before? I'm pretty sure nobody, but you can't do it anymore.
Right.
So that's the thing. It's like, it's frustrating, right? Same with the guard, same with everything. Every book is missing something or has changed something you own to the point that you almost have to buy it again.
Yeah, and that's the aspect of Games Workshop stuff that I don't enjoy. It's like, if you're giving me a better version because the sculpt is better, and it's a like for like thing. So say Terminators, for example, you had old Terminators and then you had new Terminators. The same with the whole Eldari range. They're just newer versions of the old stuff. You can still run the old stuff if you want to, but ideally, if the model's better, like it just looks nicer, people will just go out and replace stuff. But I think there are lots of models where people either won't do that because they're too numerous, like, your Hormagaunts, your Termagants, your I don't know, maybe it's like zombies or something from AOS. Like you might
Gene Stealers as well.
Gene Stealers. I can imagine lots of hoardy type stuff. You're like, the difference isn't that noticeable, and ultimately, it took me ages to paint up 40. I'm not going to do another 40 just for slightly better models. Whereas things like Terminators or general units feel much more substantial. But at the same time, it's like I would quite happily run my Krieg army. I'm not going to go out and buy the new plastic Krieg stuff, maybe some of the artillery pieces, but for where I can, I'm just going to run my old stuff. And it's like, I should be allowed to. I only got my Krieg army 10 years ago, which is nothing.
That's a lifetime, mate. That's a lifetime.
It's nothing in the world of the hobby. Like, I only sort of...
You need to buy more Krieg, Phil. You
That's what Games Workshop would say, and I would be like, if you spoke to me 5 years ago, I was desperate to buy more Krieg. I was like, please release a new unit, give us something new, and I will buy it in that resin Forge World range. I would happily do that because I want stuff to be kind of consistent, and I prefer the style and
you still would now, to be fair,
more.
wouldn't you? If they gave you another one of the resin kits from that range, you'd be
100%. I would totally be all about it. And even now, what I have been doing is, and when I get the codex, I can do it a bit more. I need to basically do an audit of my army and go, what can I still run as WYSIWYG in its current form? What can I find inspiration and lean into and sort of maybe make some new units? So my idea at the moment is to try and get hold of some really old the Grenadier models, which don't exist in the current like plastic variation, because obviously you've got the combat engineers with the skull masks, which look a bit like the Grenadiers, but the Grenadiers aren't there. But if I wanted to, I could run my existing Grenadiers as either Scions or the Kazakin, because they're basically both hotshot lasguns. So I like the idea of doing like a more Scion themed list. So maybe I can convert some to be a sort of Scion command squad, or like the Tempestus Aquilons, and then I've got more of like an elite guard force being represented by those kind of Grenadier models that don't exist in the current range. Obviously, they wouldn't really be backward compatible to like Heresy, or like if we were to play early editions of 40k, which is always something a little bit in the back of my mind because we do that from time to time. But it's like, I don't mind doing that, and I don't mind putting work and converting stuff up. But if they were to sort of just go, oh yeah, literally every single unit you own isn't viable anymore because we've replaced it with a slightly similar but differently named units, and the war gear options are all completely different, that would be super frustrating. So it is really annoying when they do that sort of stuff, and I think it's really anti-consumer, and we should try and call that stuff out when we can do, because I don't think that's good for the customer. But it's good for Games Workshop because it's sort of forcing us to buy new stuff. I would rather the carrot give me a nice new shiny model for me to buy, and I will buy it, but don't force me sort of almost begrudgingly to buy a unit I already own because it's now no longer viable and it's got to be a slightly different version of itself. That's terrible.
Yeah, but then they've had huge success with that through Primaris and other things. And again,
That's
you
true.
raise a really good point, which was the Gaunt ranges, right? Like, I wouldn't be surprised if GW looked at sales of Gene Stealer kits and Gaunt kits and were like, well, this is massively disappointing because we were expecting all the NID players to rebuy all their Gaunts. We were expecting the NID players to go, look at these sexy new Gaunt minis. I want more of those. Completely failing to appreciate what Gaunts represent to your average NID player. There's such a sort of like nothing. It's like, oh, you know, like, and that's the thing. People who have painted and collected 40, 60, 80 Gaunts aren't falling over themselves to buy more Gaunts.
No,
it's just not happening.
But they would have bought the new Lictor models, or they would have bought the new characters, or the ones that are actually new units.
Did they do it enough? Did they do it enough? And is that also informing their thinking when they're saying like, these are now Barrow Guard, these are now combat engineers, these are this, these are that. You know, where they're probably, because I think that NID launch and its probably softness probably has also had an effect, because equally, I don't know necessarily how well Sternguard did. I don't know how well the new Terminator box set did, right? Did those kits do what they were thinking? Did the new Terminator kit do Blade Guard numbers?
I would have thought so. I think the Terminator kit
I don't know. I'm just saying.
Here's the thing: we don't know.
Don't know.
I think my other point I was going to say in terms of Tyranids, like, I feel like you have to redo the old models because you're going to have a lot of new players. So the new players that are going to come in who like, oh yeah, I really want to collect Tyranids. There's a bunch of great new character models. I'm going to buy the Leviathan box set, right? There's going to be those people who will then maybe go, oh, I don't want to actually collect them because there's a bunch of really old models that are awful looking. Those Gaunt models, those old ones are horrible. Whereas now they might go, oh cool, they've updated the whole range. I can actually get the Gaunts and the Hormagaunts and the Gene Stealers, and they're the new ones, and they're going to be easier to build. So I it's sort of like, yeah, they might not be big sellers, but it's like essential for the life of an army to update the whole range with itself. So you and I think the old world probably suffers from this slightly. I think it's a double-edged sword, right? I am the nostalgia old world player. It's like, I want to have that old classic old world army. Yeah, it looks a little bit derpy. It looks a bit silly. It's from 4th and 5th edition Warhammer, but to me, that was my Warhammer growing up. Those are the models that I really love. Actually, the later stuff like 6th, 7th edition, I think are kind of terrible, some of those plastics versus the metal stuff. And I've had we've long discussed that in a while. I think the zenith of the metal sculpting was far superior than the earlier days of plastic sculpting. And it's only now where plastic is actually way far superior than the metal stuff. So I can understand that some people will look at the old world and go, oh, this new Bretonnian on foot like knights, gorgeous, because they're new.
Well, they are, yeah, they're phenomenal.
But then I can then imagine that person going, well, in fact, I know people who are like this. They will be like, but I'm not buying the army because the rest of the models are terrible, old, and 20 years old, and they look awful. As a new player, I can imagine a lot of people are like that for the old world, but I think the old world is almost a very specific, unique thing in terms of what it's trying to be. At least in this edition of the game, I suspect next edition it will be like, cool, we're all doing new plastics for everything if it's a big success. But this is like the nostalgia edition.
Yeah, totally. I think there's a thing though. I think with like that stuff and people being drawn in, the old metals versus the new plastics, and how that whole kind of process is working, again, goes back to what you were saying earlier about the idea of, give me more of the carrot, less of the stick, give me an incentive to want to buy these ranges and kind of enjoy them. But I think overall, it's an interesting situation they're in, because again, going back to the Gaunt example or going back to the new example, you're absolutely right. People probably did buy more lictors and they probably did buy more of this stuff. But and again, I can only speak anecdotally to the fact that when 9th edition 40k was being played, every single time I turned up and saw a Space Marine player, they had Blade Guard in their arm. Now, that's probably because the rules for Blade Guard were really good. However, these days, when I see Terminator squads in games of Warhammer 40,000, it's usually me playing them, or my opponent has the one squad from Leviathan because they're kind of new.
Yeah.
I very rarely see Terminators appear. I've very rarely seen Sternguard. If I do see Sternguard or I do see Terminators, they're the Leviathan kits. I've almost never seen the multi-part plastic Terminator kits in the wild, and I've almost never seen the multi-part Sternguard kit anywhere.
I think, but I imagine most Space Marine players bought the Leviathan, so therefore, do you need another unit of both of those? The same with the Blade Guard, right? Yes, there are multi-part kits, but the majority of Blade Guards you'll ever see will be from the Indomitus kit.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, again, I think that's the thing. There's so many variables to it. It's hard to say for certain because we don't know what their sales performances were. I'm just saying anecdotally, it felt like new things maybe had more impact than old things.
Yeah, and what's interesting, I think,
even though I love them,
with Sternguard especially, is yes, there are old models out there in the wild. I suspect the majority of people playing with Sternguard will use the new models because most people's Space Marine collections are now all Primaris or predominantly all Primaris, and a lot of the players will have gotten in at either 8th edition or later, like myself, or they're people that have just updated their collection because they're huge Space Marine fans. I can't imagine someone going, yeah, I've got all these old models, and I've also got all the Primaris, and oh yeah, cool, new Sternguard kits come out, but I'm still going to run my old metal Sternguard with my all plastic Primaris army. I mean, I guess it might happen, but it feels like you're now in one of two camps. You're either you're rocking the Firstborn army and that's your theme, or you're just all in on Primaris and that's predominantly all you're going to have.
I think that's it though, isn't it? I think ultimately, who knows for sure what people are doing in the general sense. I mean, I love the new Sternguard kit. I think it's one of the standout kits of the new Marine releases of 10th edition. I love the Terminator kit. I'm a big fan of both those kits. I think they're great. The Pyro Marines, the Inferno, were the real letdown for me, but the other stuff was all lovely stuff. But look, I mean, overall, I guess just to kind of try and put a bow around this conversation and sum it up, I think it's been a really interesting period in the hobby because this is the first time in my experience, which, as I identified earlier, has spanned many, many years, that we're essentially being propositioned with this need for change. And it seems like it's driven by a multitude of factors. But regardless of being kind of pragmatic about that and ultimately analysing those factors and identifying where they're coming from, the cold, hard reality is that we as consumers are being basically made to regret and feel bad for purchase decisions we've made in relative recent history, whether that's buying a codex that only had relevancy for a few months or buying a range of miniatures 6 years ago that has now been utterly eradicated and in many instances replaced for broadly the same thing. You know, it's like, oh, I got into playing Blood Angels 3 years ago, so I bought all this Death Company stuff, and now my Death Company isn't this anymore. I can still kind of use it, but how do I represent that weapon? What do I do about this? What do I do about that? It's complicated. And again, even though 99.9% of the people you play across the tabletop in a pickup game aren't going to care and are going to happily let you do it, you're still going to have a conversation about it. That's always the thing I always find, and it frustrates you because I, for a very long time, when running my Blood Angels army, would run assault squads as assault intercessors with jump packs. But I still had to have a conversation about it every time I turned up to the table because they'd be like, oh, so what are they? I was like, well, they're assault Marines. And what are you doing? What are those then? Well, they're assault intercessors with jump packs. And they're like, oh, okay. And you're like, well, yeah, because they've got a chainsword and a bolt pistol and a jump pack and they're on the same size base. It's not that hard, is it? To sort of like, you know, but you still had to say it because people had to ask because it's not the standard, you know, default miniatures. You've got to have the conversation. And I think that's the thing. I think ultimately, yes, it's fine. Most people, all the people generally are really cool with it, but you still have to go through the motions and it's still frustrating. And you still have to process all of that frustration and loss. I think there's a lot of Stormcast players who are really annoyed. There's a lot of Blood Angels players who were underserved by that release. There's a lot of Marine players in the general sense that were let down with the release of 10th. There's people with all sorts of things, Commissar Yarrick, for example, in ninth edition. There's all sorts of stuff that's gone wrong, and I think it has created a sense of skepticism within kind of people's trust and faith with GW doing the right thing. I do think this will come to a close. I think we will get to a place in the next 3 years where GW have finally ripped the plaster off entirely and drawn their lines and let us all know what is and what isn't Warhammer 40,000 anymore. But it's still frustrating because in a way, had they torn it off entirely in a oneer, I think that would have been extraordinarily painful, but you could have probably would have adjusted to it by now. This kind of death by many cuts type thing is just kind of consistently creating this dialogue around the situation that is definitely breeding some frustration. But ultimately, it is what it is. GW are clearly doing what they think is best for business and best for them. They're obviously seeing positive results for examples like Primaris and examples like, Stormcast or whatever. So fine, this is the way it is. But I think it's a shame because I genuinely used to really appreciate and love the fact that I could turn up to a game of Warhammer 40,000 in, say, 7th edition and be playing across the table from an individual with an army made entirely of miniatures that they bought in 2nd edition 40k, and there was no need for that conversation that I just expressed before between a Assault Marine and an Assault Intercessor with jump pack.
Yeah,
right?
Because it was either... it was always probably going to be on the same base for the most part. Because really the rebasing stuff only really happened, I think, from sort of 8th edition onwards when bases started.
7th edition was when it started.
Oh, okay.
That was when Marines moved on to the, what is it now, 32?
Yeah. Okay, it was 7th. Okay, yeah. But as you say, for the most part, yeah, there was a sort of slow evolution of units that was always, It was never like a big leap, and it was an evolution rather than a replacement. It's definitely led to some like kind of a lack of consumer confidence and trust in terms of the things I buy are going to be valid in the future. Whereas it used to feel like the concept of squatting was very rare. It did happen, but like once in a blue moon. Now it's like. Any day of the month, it could happen to something within Games Workshop. And then I guess you go, well, how long will it be before they do it all over again for 40k? At what point are they going to be like those Genestealer cult models or those Sisters of Battle, which, they're 5 years old at the moment, but when they're 10 years old, are they just going to wipe them all over and give them brand new models? Like, because I feel like with the current plastic range that's come out, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. Can it get any better? And, we maybe thought about that, with the old Tactical Marines when they last came out. But, yeah, at what point are they going to not be able to really redo units? Which is, I sort of feel like the whole concept of the slight differences and replacements where they're giving us something not exactly the same. And that's how they're going to get around it in the future, basically. So it'd be interesting to see what will happen. The last thing I wanted to touch on, because it does relate to this, which was a bit of armies on parade controversy that happened in the last week. So basically people found out the sort of terms and conditions for the armies on parade specifically stated that you can't use parts and models from one game system in another. So if you had converted up an army, you couldn't, say, use 30k parts in a 40k army, but also likewise you couldn't use fantasy parts like from AOS into 40k. So for example, my Thunder Warriors army, which uses Stormcast models as a base, couldn't be used or entered in because it's from a completely different game system. So this was very like hardline Games Workshop. No, everything must be from must belong to the system from which it derives, which is very extreme.
I mean, fair play to the GW store manager or Warhammer store manager who can meticulously ensure that every one of these meets that criteria. I mean, your knowledge will have to be pretty encyclopedic to be able to denote whether that, combat knife came from an old world or orc, black orc, or whether and again, like even then, right? So like, I mean, I would just as a joke for that find all the miniatures that work in both Old World and Age of Sigmar and do all of those. You know, just go straight into that. Be like, oh, there's my AOS thing, and it's just all Old World minis. Just like,
yeah. So lots of people were complaining about it, and it sounds like Games Workshop have backtracked and they did a social media post where they sort of clarified that, what we meant was like you couldn't have a Tyranid model in Age of Sigmar, for example, but if you want to use parts from a model to kitbash and convert it into something else that's more setting appropriate, that is fine. That's what it should be, right? It's of course you wouldn't have a Gene Stealer in Age of Sigmar, but if you're going to use like that head, maybe it can work.
I just recently was reading Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness, right? And that to me is like the ethos. It's the
ultimate crossover.
Mad, yeah, exactly. The mad topsy-turvy world of everything is anything. And this is the thing, right? Like up until recently, in fact, still now, you can still run a warp forge demon
Soul Grinder.
Soul Grinder, thank you. Yeah, that's still viable in multiple different armies in AOS, and that'd be hilarious. Just turn up and go, yeah, there's the one.
Here's my armies on parade. Soul Grinder army.
Exactly, it's all Soul Grinders. You're like, whatever, that's what it is.
Yeah, that one I've always found mad. But yeah, the original Slaves to Darkness book and Realms of Chaos, they back in that edition, like Rogue Trader basically made a big thing about the universes of fantasy and 40k sort of existing at the same time. You could have bolt guns in Warhammer Fantasy because it'd be like it wasn't even necessarily time travel. It was just through the warp, right? It was just things existed in both systems quite happily.
Well, it was heavily implied at one point that the Old World, or rather Warhammer Fantasy, was a world within the Eye of Terror, within the warp, right? Like that was the whole.
I think as a kid, I always assumed maybe because obviously the Old World looks like Earth, that it was like an early version of Terror before anything else. So you could have gone, it's a historical version of Earth before. But yeah, I think maybe that's the fact that they could exist at the same time is maybe it is it's within the universe somewhere, or say in the warp, and everything's a bit timey-wimey and all sorts of stuff.
Well, that was the thing with the lizard men, right? They were basically trying to follow the plan of the
Slan,
of the Slan, but the Slan were descendants, or rather
from the old ones.
It was the old ones, right? So the idea was that the old ones... Again, you don't really hear enough about the old ones anymore, do you?
That's interesting. So the Old World book, the new rule book, actually mentions, obviously talks like the history of the Old World created by the Old Ones. The first people they created were the Slan, and then obviously all the lizard men type people, and then they created the elves and the dwarves and the humans. And then obviously Chaos comes in and sort of ruins it all, and then they just jump ship and disappear. The Slan are left to sort of deal with the mess, and they make a deliberate nod and wink to Age of Sigmar in the Old World book. So it's interesting that they sort of they basically hint that the old ones know that the old world isn't going to be around forever and that something greater might come of it, which is them referencing the end times and the creation of the mortal realms.
That is all canon, though, right? Like,
exactly.
Age of Sigmar is the next stage of it. I know.
So they've sort of gone back and sort of, I guess, retcons that obviously happens. But it makes perfect sense because obviously that did happen. It's interesting they put it in there, though. I didn't know if they would, which I thought was quite interesting.
Well, there were like stories, weren't there, once upon a time where I can't remember which book it was in, but it was specifically talking about the idea that there was this silver or like white knight character that was like battling demons and like doing all the rest of it. And it was heavily stated that it was Caldor Drago from the Grey Knights, and the idea is that he was actually like he was basically battling demons in the times of fantasy, basically, and he was this bold silver warrior or whatever, like a knightly character. Anyway, we're going off on a tangent as we often do. My point is overall is that I think, yeah, it's relatively easy to assert that GW are doing what they think is best for business, and I think what they think is best for business is creating these IPs to try and essentially have kind of marketable, contained things that they can attempt to kind of offshoot into other areas of entertainment, but also enable them to kind of segment and understand the kind of breadth and popularity of those particular games and ranges, right? So I get what they're doing. The problem is with it is that as a result, this kind of weird bitty approach that they've taken in terms of releasing that and making that commonplace is ultimately a consequence of how they do business. They can't change it all overnight, right? You know, you listen to interviews with like Rick Priestley or whomever, and they talk about how 20 years ago they were talking about moving their entire range to plastic. They still haven't done it.
No,
and
even
it's 20 years later. Yeah, exactly. So,
it takes a while to steer that ship. I mean, it's also interesting to go on a slight tangent, but it does relate to this, is that Games Workshop doesn't always get it right. So obviously they destroyed the old world and then did Age of Sigmar, but then Total War stuck around and was advertising, free advertisement for the old world and for a model range that you could get in Age of Sigmar at the time, but the rank and flank square bases thing just didn't exist at that point.
Well, it did in vanilla Age of Sigmar. At the very start,
yes, you could have kept your bases. Yeah, that is true. But the fantasy setting that was advertised in the Total War game didn't exist because that was the old world, not the Mortal Realms. And then you have a slight similar thing happening. So obviously they try to get rid of Death Watch outside of the agents of the Imperial Agents. So the classic, the classic Death Watch veterans existed, but that was kind of it, and the Corvus Black Star. But then you had obviously Space Marine 2, which is entire intro sequence was old school Death Watch veterans. And then you had, I think it was Joy Toys did an animation for the not Warhammer Fest, Warhammer Anniversary, and it was
it was Namco.
Namco, it was a completely random company, right? And it was again veteran, old style Space Marines, but Death Watch, and I was once again advertising Death Watch, and then you have Astartes 2 trailer come out again, obviously all old style Space Marines, but then the teaser for it is that it's Death Watch, and it's like all the outside media, with the exception of Secret Level, is advertising on some level Death Watch. But then
even Secret Level has a nod to Death Watch because it's got
one of them. Yes, well, yes, technically true.
So and he's carrying iconography of the Death Watch. Anyway,
but
it's very tenuous. Well, not tenuous. It's quite direct, but you have to know.
Yeah, but all the outside media is pointing at some level to Death Watch. But then Games Workshop internally for 40k is trying to do away with Death Watch as a faction outside of the Imperial Agents, which just doesn't really make sense. If people are coming into the game fresh and they've seen any of that outside media, they're going to be like, oh, Death Watch, where can I get hold of it? And it's like, oh, well, you could, there's these Space Marines, but they're not really Death Watch, and you can't really run Death Watch. I mean, now you can because of the legacy PDF.
I still think Death Watch make more sense as a unit within other armies.
I
do understand. But I do absolutely understand that they've dug themselves into this situation. I think genuinely, like, they figured it out with Mechanicum because basically they had Codex Qatari, Codex Agmech, and they managed to smush them together and range it to the point where they went, this one now makes sense in its own thing. It almost has no reason to exist because it essentially is like another flavour of Guard with a few extra weird things thrown in, but whatever, it exists now, so let it be, and we'll come one day we'll figure out how to write some interesting rules for it, but it hasn't happened yet. Although, to be fair, it depends how you interpret interesting, because they definitely had a lot of complicated rules. Whether those are interesting or not is up to you. And then they've done it again with Harlequins. Harlequins were a late 7th edition where they went, oh, Harlequins, everyone loves Harlequins, and now they're going, oh God, what do we do with these? Let's just put them into Eldari and try and figure it out. Yannari, oh God, what have we done? Put it into there, do something with it. Same thing with GSC to an extent, although they has sort of managed to kind of carve out a little niche, but they're kind of like, really GSC should just be like a few bolt-ons to a guard army or a few bolt-ons to a mid army to try and give them a bit of flavour, but they've made them their own thing. I think they've done all right with GSE and AdMech because they've done enough, but they're definitely in the case of Deathwatch, Harlequins, and Ynnari.
I guess
they're just
technically Scions were also...
Scions were one as well.
They got
Scions
their own book,
yeah.
but then obviously... It's weird because those things are all much like in AOS. AOS does sort of mini factions much better, where they're like, cool, here's your Gloom Spike. It's basically 4 sub factions that are all quite distinct from each other. Yeah, they're all quite distinct, and you can theme your army in and lean into just one of those things if you want, or you can do a bit of everything. Although I do constantly feel like it's like, just split them out. Like for Orruk Warclans, where you've got your Ironjaws and you've got your Cruel Boys, they just feel like they should be 2 separate books. But I can understand that they are just keeping them all together under one. Yeah, and similar like with Scions, it's like they're sort of not quite big enough to be an army in their own right, but they feel like they should be. But they'd need a lot more in terms of like units to do that. But then maybe there just needs to be a bit like the Gene Stealer Cult rule, where it's like, yeah, cool, you can add in some extra guard stuff if you want, but predominantly they should be their own separate thing. And same with Harlequins should really be like that. It's like either, I don't know if that like they just don't have the will, or maybe they just don't think they need more units. Maybe they're like, no, the law for Harlequins is just these things and that's it. There is no more scope to create new units, which sounds puzzling because you would have thought Games Workshop would, if they wanted to, just go, yeah, here's some new stuff.
Yeah, but I think the reality is like really at the end of like 7th edition or 6th edition, 7th edition, you got the Scions, you got the Deathwatch, you got the we've done the examples, but the point is they were just these little things that were intended more to be like added on to stuff, but they kind of frivolously went, but you could make armies out of them.
Yeah.
But then 8th edition came along and said, no, you will make armies out of them. They're armies now. And then ever since then, people are going, why did we do that? Like, and now people have built armies for Deathwatch, they've built armies for Grey Knights, they've built armies for Harlequins, and Games Workshop are going, yeah, we mucked up, we need to roll that back. But the thing is they now are in this position where
they're upsetting people. Yeah,
exactly. But that's on top of upsetting more people all the time. Yeah. And the thing is, right, it's like, here's the thing. I think enough of us are sensible enough and mature enough to understand what they've given Deathwatch right now is a stopgap, but they are going to just become a unit. Yeah. Right? Like that's what's happening. Harlequins have become that. They've just sort of had to suck it up. Ynnari, to be honest, at this point, should just get deleted. They're pointless. Like, I don't understand why they even bother, but they do it because for whatever reason, they can't help themselves but give Ynnari units the most mental rules. So they're going to just eventually go, here you go, Ynnari players. Yet again, you're the best version of Elder, so the tournament players will use you.
Do you think?
Well, I don't know if they are yet.
Okay. Well, I guess
but that's just,
we'll find out.
There has never been an edition thus far where Ynnari haven't been the best way to take Elder armies. Like, right. So we'll wait and see. But anyway, my point is that, yeah, I think it is interesting because obviously, for example, what could be happening with the Grey Knights? We know Grey Knights are potentially, we know Grey Knights are coming around the corner, or at least we think we do. Were they in the roadmap?
Yes, I want to say they were, yeah. And they did say they were getting a codex for sure when obviously Grey Knights, so when Deathwatch, they were like, nah, you're not getting that.
So maybe we're getting a full refresh on Grey Knights and that'd be great, but that's the thing, like Grey Knights probably can support that. Yeah,
well, Grey Knights really has got a decent sized army and sort of more unique stuff than Deathwatch. I think that the caveat with Deathwatch is I can see why, if you're a new player. So my example was there's cool loads of Deathwatch media out there. You come into the hobby brand new. You want to be a Deathwatch player. Let's say you go, okay, cool, there's a legacy PDF, my rules are free, great. And then you'll be like, oh, what these kill team things to, Joe at the Games Workshop store? And he's like, well, you can buy some Intercessors, and you can buy some Hellblasters, and you can buy some Pyroblasters. And you've got to buy all 3 boxes to make one unit of your kill team. And you'll be like, that's over £100. Can't I just run them as one unit? And you're like, oh, well, you can, but they're not the kill teams. They're just the regular Space Marines painted black with a silver shoulder pad. So from that logic of coming into the whole concept of kill teams, I could understand that being very daunting and maybe frustrating as a new player, because it's not just like I'm buying a box and building it, which is Games Workshop's mantra for everything. Like, it's got to have rules because it's going to have rules for the things in the box. And Kill Teams throws that out the window. And that's very sort of old school converting, kit bashing, which I don't mind. And I think the concept of Kill Teams is kind of cool, but as we've discussed many times, I don't think it's necessarily army-wide appropriate. I think adding them into an extra force is sort of, to me, where the flavour of Death Watch is, rather than doing a full army of Death Watch, as cool as that would be in and of its own right.
Well, indeed. Well, yeah, I agree with you. I think it's confusing because, again, you're right. In the case of Total War, it was mad. I always remember going into the store and seeing their kind of propaganda, their advertising for basically, oh, you play Total War, buy the army. And it was like literally all these like random higgledy-piggledy Empire and, Dark Elf miniatures being shown off. But it was sort of like, I was like, cool, how do I run them? And it's like, that's confusing because we don't really know how to explain this to you. Because now they're not, they're now under the banner of the Cities of Sigmar, and it's like, okay, this is whatever. Immediately, they did do those legacy PDFs for the specific old armies for Old World, which still, I think, are not in effect to this day. I think you still can run some of those old formations, those armies of legends, those historical armies. But anyway, yeah, the Death Watch thing is interesting. It's all interesting. I think ultimately the most sensible thing that I would say to anyone getting into it is that, ultimately, if you're starting out with the hobby and you're wanting to play and get involved with it, your best bet is to just stick with the mainstream current kind of ranges and not try to diversify too much. If it looks like it's an old kit or it has a Space Marine with a funny head that you don't recognise because it's not a Primaris one, don't buy it because it's probably getting discontinued. Ultimately, it's just weird. It's a weird time in the hobby because everything feels very, not negative, but definitely frustrating because you just, because you put a lot of energy into these projects. You put a lot of yourself into it. You really want to kind of express yourself and have something truly uniquely yours, and you get excited about these ideas and these armies and these concepts, and then they just come along and go, yeah, but no. And you're like, oh man, like I put so much work into this and now I can't show it off. And it's like, oh well.
It's not like it's a pack of cards that you spent a fiver on. It's a bit more disposable. It's something you spent a lot of money on. You spent a lot of time building it and painting it, and you want to then be able to play. And most people don't play every week. A lot of people play once every few months. So you want that unit to still be around ultimately for years. That's why it was like 10 years is not a long time. If you only game like twice a year with a buddy that you see once in a blue moon, that's, in 10 years, that could just be like 20 games, which isn't anything. But obviously that's not a lot of gaming by most people's standards. But I had a similar issue recently. So obviously I've been looking at Soulblight Gravelords for Age of Sigmar. I had a corpse cart that I got for a kit bash ages ago. I did this Rat King model where I took the dead bodies and turned them into dead bodies with some legs on. And that was like a little kind of kit bash that I made. But I've got the rest of the corpse cart model. And I was like, oh, should I build that? And it's like, yeah, I'm missing some bits and I could maybe get that on a bit site. And I'm like, well, I'll just hold out until the book comes out because it's coming in the next month. That corpse cart model is an old fantasy model. So it might go away in the new edition because all the fantasy models are feeling like they're being extracted via Chinook to the old world, right? So it might be, but then again, that model might later on be replaced with a brand new, like-for-like, cool new Age of Sigmar mini, and maybe I'd rather have that than an old one that I've maybe converted up to fill in the missing bits that I've got. So yeah, it's a bit of a rock and a hard place with things like that, and maybe that's just a sort of, very niche specific thing to my situation. But I think
Oh, yeah.
a lot of people are like that when they're collecting models. There's a bunch of like sort of fantasy models in the existing AOS lines, and do you want to buy it now? And, you know, maybe it's valid for this edition, but you're not 100% sure it'll be valid for the next edition because that model might disappear to go back to fantasy. And likewise, a bunch of stuff for, you know, 40k might happen as well because it looks a bit dated and might just be replaced with something else. So yeah, it's something that all buyers have to be aware of, at least when they're buying kits that aren't brand new ones.
But also as well, I suppose, and again, we should obviously make a point of saying this. This is all predicated around. I've used predicated a lot in this conversation. I apologise. This is all stated from the perspective of people that are buying miniatures with the express purpose of using them as gaming pieces. The reason why this all isn't anti-consumer and all negative, even though you can make the connection and make the argument that you purchase these things as a direct response to the game system and the rules as written. The reality is you still own the physical artifact that you bought, and so much of the kind of ancillary, the extra stuff, the rules and all of that kind of, you know, fleeting ideas are just that, right? Like, they're relevant for the moment, but they will change over time. But even then, the rules will exist in perpetuity, so you can still use and play older editions of the game, and you can still have and collect and own these miniatures. So it does become one of those weird things where it's like, you can be all like butthurt about it because you'll be going, oh, my, old Stormcast army isn't relevant. Well, it's like, yeah, well, you just continue to use it in an old edition of the game, or you still own the kits. Now, I get you. That is relevant to those people, but there are plenty of people out there who bought Stormcast kits, painted them up and put them on a shelf and never put them on a tabletop. And that probably actually represents a larger proportion of GW's customer base than us who want to play the game with it. So this is the thing. It's like, as much as this is irritating and it is creating bad vibes amongst people who play Games Workshop games, how much of an impact does it really have on their overarching customer base? And the answer is probably not very much, because ultimately it's about the churn. At the end of the day, for every one of us grumpy old 40-year-olds who've had enough of the way that GW is and are moving on to do something else, there's a 10-year-old waiting in the wings to take your place. And that's just how it is. You know, this is the churn. Ultimately, no one is irreplaceable. You don't matter. Your thoughts and feelings are irrelevant. And ultimately, Games Workshop will continue to do everything they can to make as much money out of everyone they have addicted to this strange but wonderful hobby in perpetuity. And that is my closing statement on it. Phil, take us home before I transition us out of here.
Open up your wallet and pay out is what you're saying. In a slightly more thought out answer, I think you are right to an extent. I think saying you can just play old editions is a bit of a wishy-washy answer. Yes, you technically can, but most people don't. But you should, and I actually think more people should be doing those kind of things. More people should be embracing the old school concept of just making rules up for something. And I feel like the current zeitgeist around Games Workshop is they are the arbiter of everything, and what they say goes. And I don't think that should be the case. I think people should be much more comfortable with making up their own missions, and they should be much more comfortable with them taking old units and giving them new life by writing new rules for them. It's like, yeah, you can't use a Leviathan Dreadnought in 40k anymore, but why not? Just find that old PDF and just port it across and give it some new points, or create your own rules based on it. I think those sorts of things are much more fun and interesting to do within the hobby, but those require friends or a gaming group that is very open-minded about those things. And a lot of people are just tournament players, and obviously you can't do those things at tournaments. And I think that's where the real sort of sticking point for me is on those sorts of things. If that's the sort of thing you're predominantly going to be doing, then you are a bit stuck with those old models. But yeah, overall, it is what it is. And yes, open up your wallet and pay out for new stuff. So says Games Workshop.
Transitional noise. Wow.